Hi, welcome back to the FDI seminar. Having gone through FDI and discussed the basics, identified the different perspectives of major players in the FDI arena, we're now ready to move on to a more nuanced discussion. We're curious to know what companies look at when they identify the risks and rewards of a potential project. We're going to look more specifically at the risk side, because it's an often misunderstood part of the analysis and the equation, both from foreign investors' perspective and some host governments. So when we talk about the risk side of the equation with foreign investments, we're primarily concerned with political risk. I'm going to move back to the PowerPoint presentation now so that we can go back to where we left off. More specifically, we're going to look at this study, which encapsulates a majority of the studies done on C-level executives who are going into emerging market countries, who almost all agree that political risk is the primary concern associated with such projects. However, we really want to understand what they mean by that. And so in order to understand what political risk concerns are, we need to understand first, what's the scope of political risk? What are specific examples and risks associated with political risk? What causes these losses? What are the precursors to these losses? Then we move into how can these risks be assessed? How can they be managed? And we'll provide a few examples of how this actually helps investment promotion agencies. So while there's conflicting definitions of political risk, the most prevalent definition, and the one that I think is the most accurate, is right here. The risk of a strategic, financial, or personnel loss for a firm because of such non-market factors as macroeconomic and social policies/regulations, or events related to political instability. What I want to distill out of this definition for the purposes of this conversation moving forward is that there's two primary words we're worried about. First is the policies and regulations. Those are decisions, as we all know, made by host government legislators and regulators and are ultimately upheld or rejected by judiciaries in those countries. And then we're looking more specifically at events that can cause losses for foreign investors. And what do we mean by events? Well, here we're talking about riots, coup d'etat, civil war, insurrection. We're more interested in understanding how those events impact foreign investors, and then how can such risks be assessed and managed. Let's go over specific political perils, as they're called in the industry, or specific political risks that affect foreign investors. So the first and most common political risk based on a host government policy or regulation or law is direct expropriation. And this is simply an example or scenarios where host governments, by law or by decree, rule that an asset or an investment that was formerly held by a foreign investor has officially become the property of the host government. And so there's a lot of laws that are related to direct expropriation, and a lot of different scenarios in which companies are compensated. But for the purposes of this conversation, we're just worried in the direct expropriation and direct seizure of a foreign investment. Next, we're going to look at indirect expropriation. This is an example of where a regulation or a policy impacts a foreign investment, may have a similar outcome as a direct expropriation, but doesn't actually officially declare that it's the foreign investment becomes the property of the host government. We'll go through some examples of that as well. Finally, the third example is currency and convertibility and breach of contract. And I just provide a couple quick examples here of recent losses and how recent they are and how significant they are in amounts of money. and an overall impact on foreign investors. So direct expropriation, as I mentioned, is just the official seizure of a project. In 2012, the Argentinian host government decided that it would nationalize Spanish-owned YPF, and it became the property of the Argentinian government. And it's really not much more to a direct expropriation than a decision by the foreign investor, by the host government to officially seize the project. Now, it's important to understand the causes and the precursors of these events. International politics and economic interdependence are common causes or precursors of direct expropriation. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that it's helpful for foreign investors and for host governments to identify signals that expropriations might be coming up soon or might follow in the medium term. And so international politics, where there's a poor relationship between the home country and the host country has made a decision that it's going to expropriate a foreign investment. The property and the investment of a company within the home country with whom the host country doesn't get along with might be more of a target of the direct expropriation than an investment from a home country in which the relationships are good with the host country. By the same logic, where there's economic interdependence between the two countries, the host government is less likely to expropriate an investment from a home country on which it relies economically in trade or for aid in a number of different ways. And then the industry exposures. This is a very important aspect of understanding how to impact foreign investments and how to understand what the true exposures of companies are. Companies that are in the business of commodity extraction, as I've mentioned before, oil and gas, the extractive industries, copper, silver, such commodities, where the government will have an easy time selling the product and marketing it, that becomes more of a target than an industry where the host government is going to have a harder time reselling the product. So we all know that oil and gas and these commodities are traded on a global scale, and the ability to find buyers for this product and to easily quantify how much they're worth makes it easier for governments to take control and then generate profit from what they're expropriating. Let's look at indirect expropriation. Indirect expropriation is the outcome of a regulation or policy by a host government that has the same impact as a direct expropriation. So in this scenario, a host government that it wants to capture additional taxes or generate additional revenues from a company will, in some cases, implement taxes or other regulations that will extract more money from the foreign investor, and in some cases make it impossible for the foreign investor to carry out its FDI project. So let's take an example. In 2012, the Indonesian government had a number of foreign investors that were exploring and extracting resources, more specifically minerals, in their country, and then were exporting the commodities that were extracted to various countries throughout the world, including the home country. What happened soon thereafter was that the Indonesian government implemented a regulation, a policy, a ban on exports of unprocessed minerals in order to increase the processing activities of its local FDI projects. And so what happened was the foreign investors who had previously been enjoying the right to extract the commodity and then export it to various countries could no longer export their product. You could only imagine what the impact of this regulation and policy was on the business model of these foreign investors, and perhaps more importantly to them, on their profit margins. So in these cases, the indirect expropriation is a little more subtle than the direct expropriation. But the outcome is very similar, if not the same. It renders the project unprofitable and inoperable, even though it doesn't officially declare that the assets and the project are the property of the foreign investor. What are causes? Very similar to direct expropriation. The causes are that the political context has a very big impact. So whereas in the direct expropriation, we were looking at international politics, here domestic politics becomes a big factor. And what we mean by that is when host governments have relationships with foreign investors that they've established over time, and upcoming elections produce a change in regime, the new regime might find it politically favorable to target a foreign investment that happened under the previous regime and make life on the investor a little more difficult, and then extract more of the revenue generated from the foreign businesses' activities for the use of the government. The regime change is a primary cause and precursor of an indirect expropriation. So no matter how safe an investment might be at any point in time, as long as that investment is operating in a representative democracy where there's ongoing and periodic elections, the foreign investor is always vulnerable to changes and to outcomes of indirect expropriation. Now, this is a very interesting part of understanding which industries are more exposed to indirect expropriation. Here we look at what's called the obsolescence bargain, which is just a fancy way of saying that companies in industries as in oil and gas, the extractive industries, where they're establishing a manufacturing facility, something that's very fixed that you can't easily move. An oil and gas project in a specific country is going to have a very hard time moving all of its equipment, its personnel to another country where they have similar resources. The point is that when they go into a foreign country and are looking for oil and gas or other resources, that is a fixed investment that is not mobile, that is not easy to move, and that as a result of indirect expropriation really would not have much recourse or options for establishing their project on somewhere else. However, a company that has very low intensive labor costs may be renting a facility with which to manufacture their products, is nimble, can very easily move to another country to establish and manufacture their products, they are less likely of a candidate to be the target of an indirect expropriation because of their versatility and their ability to avoid the impact of the regulation simply by getting up and leaving the country. Now, for each one of these perils, there are different industries which are more exposed to certain risks. Now, let's move on to currency and convertibility. In order to understand currency and convertibility, we need to first understand how companies in foreign countries generate profits, how they hold their money in foreign countries, and then how they move money from the host country back to the home country. So in most scenarios, a multinational company is going to have a local relationship with a local bank in the host country where they're doing business in the local currency. So let's take the example of Intel in Costa Rica. And let's say that for the purposes of this explanation, they're actually selling products in Costa Rica and are doing business in the local currency in Costa Rica. They generate their profits, they generate their revenue, and they will deposit it in a local bank in Costa Rica, in Costa Rican currency. Then, in order to move the money back to the United States, back to the banks that are associated with the parent company in California, they need to get approval from the host country's bank, which is Costa Rica, the Costa Rican Central Bank, to convert money, their profits from the local currency to dollars, and then repatriate that currency, which means convert it to dollars and then send it from the bank in the host country to a bank in the home country. What happens often is that in some cases, as I mentioned in Chile and historically, host governments will impose capital controls, which are restrictions on the ability to convert local currency. So the definition is, if an insured is unable to convert local currency earnings or debt service to hard currency and repatriate it in a timely way, they will have suffered a currency inconvertibility. What the example is, it doesn't necessarily need to be profits or dividends. It could be any form of payment. It could be a payment of a loan going from the host company, the subsidiary in the host country going back to the bank in the home country. It's merely a way of moving money. So when these capital controls are implemented, which often happen in the aftermath of devaluations that are implemented by host governments for a number of reasons, but number one reason is to stimulate exports from their country. Oftentimes when the value of the currency goes down, investors and domestic residents and civilians will try and get their money out of the country because it's worth less, which is known as capital flight. And in order to prevent capital flight, host governments will implement capital controls that prevent this movement. Such a risk can, if manifested, can decimate a company's quarterly earnings and be detrimental to the ongoing success of the project. So there's certain industries that are more exposed to currency inconvertibility than others. And those with corporate equity in a subsidiary carry the highest exposure. Now let's move on to political violence. As we mentioned before, these are events that happen that are in connection with political developments in host countries, but aren't necessarily carried out by host government officials, unlike the regulations and the policies that we mentioned in the previous example. Here we're talking about insurrections, revolution. The coup is obviously more connected with the government, and civil unrest. And so when one of these events occurs, there can be significant damage done to foreign investors' assets, whether it's mobile equipment, whether it's computer and machinery, whatever the fixed asset might be, there is potential damage that it could suffer as a result of one of these manifestations of political violence. Or the other way that there can be damage is when there are work stoppages. And this is called business interruption. In many countries, workers on local projects that are managed and owned by foreign investors are sometimes intimidated or encouraged to stop working by local movements that are in opposition to the foreign investors and prevent workers from going to work and feeling safe, which sometimes lead to strikes, sometimes lead to negotiations between those who are intimidating workers and the actual employees themselves. And such business interruption can have a material effect on foreign businesses. As we know, time is money and each day is costly. So let's think about the different ways in which this understanding can help economic development agencies and international investment promotion agencies who are trying to persuade companies to come to their countries. I can tell you that from my 18 years in working in political risk and in advising foreign investors and in host governments, that not all foreign investors and their executives understand the contents of the presentation that I've given to you thus far. More specifically, they may have a vague notion of what political risk is in its abstract sense, but when asked what are the specific ways in which political risks impacts foreign projects, they may not be well familiar with a lot of these scenarios. And so by understanding that there are several forms of political risk and there are several scenarios in which outcomes can affect companies, we can narrow the scope of a risk exposure. And then when we take when we take an abstract notion of political risk and we make it more specific, and we identify specific events and regulations that affect companies, we then can narrow the scope even further by identifying the type of industries that are most exposed to these risks. So let's take the example of a political violence risk exposure. If a foreign investor is manufacturing widgets, let's say, and they're looking to establish a manufacturing facility in country X, they, in their ambiguous understanding of political risk, understand that there's a lot of upside to going into country X to manufacture and distribute widgets. However, the host country has a reputation for being a very politically risky country to go into. And so the specific risks are unimportant to the foreign investor. They're really just staying away from the potential project because of the instability. And so the instability comes with the perceived risk versus the real risk. The perceived risk in this scenario would be that the whole country is off limits to a potential investment. The real risk would be that violence and uprising in isolated areas of the country are going to discourage investors from coming to the country. The Colombian company, we're going to take a break right now. I apologize. There's some technical difficulties, and I'll be back to finish up the presentation in shortly. Thank you. Hey there. What's up? Listen, are you in the library or something? It's been a battle. It's been a battle. I can't. It's okay. It's okay. I finally figured out how to do it.